Hey, welcome back to HailChatter. We have a great interview today. We talk with Becky Adams-Selin and John Adams, who are researchers with ICECHIP.
So imagine 100 researchers chasing down hailstorms. They have drones ready, they have mobile radars, all to collect data on these different hailstorms.
And if you didn't immediately put it together, ICECHIP is an acronym, which they'll explain in the interview, but it refers to hail, which is perfect for HailTrace because we are also all about hail here. Now, Becky and John, they talk about how hail is finally getting its moment to be researched. You know, we've seen that tornado research before, we've seen wind research. Now it's time for hail. This is the first of its kind project, and they're doing some fascinating things to study hail in the field, from cloud to ground, before, during, and after the storm. So if you're a weather junkie like us, you're going to love this interview.
And before we jump in, if you haven't already, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode with a friend.
Well, thanks for joining us today. I'm meteorologist Taylor Cox. We've got Collin Hunt in the middle here and Ben Baranowski, COO of HailTrace, on the top right side of your screen. Now, joining us today from ICECHIP, we are so excited to welcome Becky Adams-Selin, Senior Manager of Science, and John Allen, Professor of Meteorology at Central Michigan. Thank you guys for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, I know that we just gave a lot of information to our audience, and we're about to give some really cool information about ICECHIP here. It's a collaborative research, actually the first of its kind in over 40 years in the U.S. So let's start out by just giving a high-level understanding of what is ICECHIP, what does it stand for? Because it's a long string of words that we have combined into a really cool acronym.
you got to have the cool acronym, man. It's key to science. Yeah, it's the in situ collaborative experiment for the collection of hail in the plains. And basically our goal is to observe all the pieces of a hailstorm, from when the hail forms aloft all the way to when it falls out on the ground, and the damage it causes, all at the same time. And we've got a collaborative group to do that, including over 12 universities and 3 additional institutions, 4 countries, just all sorts of folks coming together to try to solve this big problem.
International, you said 4 countries there.
Yes, Switzerland, Germany, Canada, Australia, and then we even had a couple of researchers from China join us for a bit.
Wow, that is really cool. So all of them coming, of course, to study hailstorms in the U.S., and that's what you guys did this past spring, right? When did this process first start to get this research going?
Go for it, John.
Yeah, so the discussions probably started somewhere in about 2019, where a group of us actually on another project, Becky and I were working on another project together, and we sort of started talking about what the limitations of hail science were. And eventually a group of us sort of got together and said, well, why don't we do something about it? And 6 years and thousands of hours of meetings later, and a lot of conversations, several rounds of proposals, and a lot of evolutions of what ICECHIP was and how big we thought it needed to be to sort of accomplish the goals that we were looking to solve. We finally had the opportunity to put that together this past summer.
Well, and you're going in the direction that I wanted to head in as well. You mentioned those limitations that you want to solve or fill in those gaps. What are some of those that you identified?
I mean, sorry, I'll throw a few things in. Yeah, we both have things we can discuss, I'm sure. Yeah, on a very basic level, if you want to forecast hail, you need to know where it falls, and that's difficult. It's even setting aside the fact that we kind of need to have, based on our current reporting structure, we've got to have people in order to know if the hail has fallen there. There's a whole bunch of more things about hail that we don't know. Things like how, things beyond just, hey, what's its maximum size? Like, what's its shape? How fast is it falling? How hard does it fall? How much of it falls? All these things that we just have no idea about currently. And the last time there's been research done on this is, maybe the 60s and 70s, because there just hasn't been the information to do so. There are other issues that I'll let John speak to, but there's also been, in the intervening 40 years, a lot of technology development of new types of instrumentation that we can use, mobile radars, so we can actually move around and see the storms, sense them, where they are, and instead of having to wait for them to come to us, just whole strides of new avenues that we can explore.
And I think that it's important to sort of recognize that the purpose of ICECHIP compared to some of those earlier field campaigns is sort of chalk and cheese as well, right? So what we're really looking at going back were efforts towards hail suppression. They were generally fixed placed locations, and they were experimenting to see, was hail suppression a meaningful way to approach things? And so that was really what motivated a lot of those studies. And they were deploying fixed arrays. There was one in Montana, there was some in Colorado, but they really had a lot of sort of tethers because a lot of the instruments they were using just weren't mobile. So they deploy a very dense array of instruments, but if you got a hit during a whole season, that was considered to be excess, right? The entire National Hail Research Experiment only had a few cases compared to something like ICECHIP, where we were out trying to get on the order of 20 plus cases for a season, and we're infinitely successful in doing so. So, having a large sample of these things is the other side of the problem, right? We have hailstones where we've, let's say the Dallas-Fort Worth hailstorm back in the 2015, that was sort of talked about from 2015. Very impactful storm, very expensive storm, very well documented because it was over the urban area, right? So we had a lot of damage information, we had a lot of radar information, we had a lot of ground observations that we sort of put together to get that picture. But that's, once and every now and again, we get a storm like that. What we were trying to get is a systematic observation of everything from the ground to the cloud, so you can start thinking about, well, how do we approach radar algorithms, right? Our radar algorithms are really based on a very, very small sample. A lot of people don't recognize that MESH, right, the maximum expected size of hail, which is a radar-derived product based on reflectivity, is actually derived from a case of 9 storms in Oklahoma back in the 90s, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's a relatively small sample that was used to train that algorithm. Well, when you bring something like ICECHIP to the fore, where you're trying to get a very comprehensive view of the swath, you can start thinking about, well, how good is the extent of my mesh, right? How good is the extent of my radar coverage? Could I look at different products, right? Radar has come a long way since a lot of what we've developed there, right? We've got a lot of the dual prol products and similar. We haven't had the observations to sort of bound those and say, okay, could we use this more effectively to come up with a better product?
I didn't know that mesh is primarily or completely based off of storms in Oklahoma. And I have just within my last year at HailTrace noticed how different storms are from Oklahoma, which I'm very familiar forecasting, to North Dakota, to, Michigan. Like these storms are wildly different from state to state and region to region. So mesh is obviously not going to perform as well in other regions as it would probably in Oklahoma. That's very interesting.
And there has been some effort. Look, I won't say there hasn't been efforts to refit it and explore that, but none of them have really had anything but like the systematic observations that you need to sort of explore that. And one of the problems we've seen in a lot of radar products, right, is that this particular radar product is, it's pretty good at saying, am I going to get hail or not under a storm? Its correlation to the spatial coverage in terms of damage has been shown to be sort of displaced. And we also know that it doesn't tend to do well in estimating hail sizes in excess of about 50 millimeters or a couple of inches. And those are the ones that we really tend to care about. You tend to get false positives for lots of small hail or very large hail. The distance from radar matters to how strong your intensity and reflectivity is. The calibration of the radar itself can make a difference. Certain radars run hot. And so it makes radar-based hail estimation, at least the way we've done it up until now, quite challenging.
Oh, well, and, we've talked a lot about the limitations whenever it comes to hail science and hail research and maybe even hail forecasting as well. But I kind of actually want to go way back. Why hail? Because, high wind, tornadoes, people would often say that's so impactful. And I know I've read a few things about why hail, but I want to hear it from you guys. What factored in to making the choice to study hail and not, some of those more visual storms, like a downburst or a tornado or something like that?
Fair. Right. Well, for one thing, I'll be crass here and say tornadoes had their day, man. They had several fancy field campaigns already in the 90s and 2000s. Additionally, they're also a lot more rare. Hail is darn common, as you can see by the fact that we just one summer we were able to observe as many hailstorms as we did. And because it's so common, it's the number one cause of most expensive. Let's see. If you look at all damage caused by severe convective storms, all insurance damage, hail is the number one thing out of that because it's so frequent. It's really easy to damage shingle. There's lots of areas that can take that damage, and so just the frequency of it makes it a very common problem. And beyond damage, I mean, it's also a hazard to flight, moving airplanes around, hazard to. I mean, there are some people who were actually killed by hail in Europe a couple of years ago. It's sort of everywhere, and it affects us. It has a big effect economically, and it can have an effect on kind of more immediate life and damage as well.
And I'd be interested to know, like, okay, so if we go, you guys, so you coming into this research, you plan to go into the field and start collecting some of this data, kind of storm chasing for about 6 weeks, and your team was. I think, what is it, about 60 or so people that was part of that team?
Close to 100.
It was.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was a big team going out researching this. Kind of walk us through what that looked like through those 6 weeks. What was it like to storm chase? And was there a specific storm that you guys stood out to you in being able to collect this data?
I'll say we're lucky enough that there are several storms that stand up. Like, it's not just one. We have an embarrassment of excellent cases.
Yeah, I would say, there's a level of orchestration, right? And so, I would say that not all of us had been out and maybe spent this time of chasing storms. I've had the fortunate, I've been a long-term storm chaser. I grew up in Sydney. You think about motivation for hail. I grew up in Sydney, Australia in the early 1990s, where a hailstorm was sort of what happened all the time, right? And so that kind of got me into the field at that point, though I didn't know that was going to be a career. But, I've always been someone who's gone out and observed storms. For me, that aspect wasn't as eye-opening as the orchestration of a number of groups like this, right? We're talking about 30 vehicles, vehicles with different missions, ensuring that radars operate when they're meant to operate. Many interesting things can happen from that perspective. Whether deploying instruments can be done safely when we're dealing with tornadoes, right? Tornadoes were actually the enemy in this project. We really didn't want to have that because that caused safety issues. But, the process of getting these teams together, right? This training started for some teams well into the early part of 2025. Were running for months, that they were actually running through the deployment trainings. Some of the groups, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety was a participant. They've been doing this. They've been doing small scale campaigns for years, so they have quite extensive experience. Other groups, the first time they met was when we were doing our training days, when we're actually arrived in Boulder to sort of get everything together and ready to go out in the field. And so getting across some of those hurdles that come from sort of getting used to the equipment, getting used to working together, getting used to the communications methods, right? I mean, we were using a combination of radio, a program called Guru, which is a sort of a command orientation software, and other messaging services to sort of make sure people were in the right spot, but then also out of the way when the hailstorm came through, right? The whole goal here within ICECHIP was to be extremely safe about the way we did it. When we originally came up with this plan for how we were going to deploy instruments, the idea was to get in as late as we could so that we could make sure we lined up with the swath itself, but then get teams out and clear without having to worry about hail damage, without having to worry about any of the other attendant phenomena. And I would say to a large degree we were successful in that respect. There were challenges when we had flash flooding. There were challenges with road closures. There were challenges with power lines. All sorts of things that normally happen in the chase, the process of storm chasing. But I would say that scientific storm chasing is very much a different beast to the recreational version thereof. There is a lot more. These are long days for ground teams. an 18-hour day wasn't an unusual thing. We'd have downtime. We were operating for 42, 44 days, something on that order.
I believe 6 of those days were officially fully down. So there was,
yes,
yeah.
And because we'd have to relocate, so we did 15,000 miles in that period, right? You can quickly do the math and see just how many. With 6 fully down days where we didn't move, every other day we were moving, relocating. We covered everywhere from basically near the Texas-Mexico border post on the Rio Grande, all the way up into far northern North Dakota.
Yep.
Now, did you mainly focus on plains weather? Is that mainly where you were, throughout the plains?
Well, we also tried to focus on some orographically influenced storms, and we got some of those. It wasn't quite as active of the year as we would have liked. Largely, we had just an embarrassment of plains convection, but yeah, we were able to get a couple orographically influenced, which is important because so it's important because there's different environments in which they form. There's different factors that help the updrafts form with the terrain sloping, et cetera. It also can form in maybe different convective modes. And that's kind of a key point of ICECHIP as well, was that we didn't want to focus solely on, hey, your real fancy supercell in the plains that's churning out giant hail. We wanted to get that, and we did, but we also wanted to get, hey, here's maybe some unorganized multicellular convection that's being generated off of a local terrain feature, or here's some single cells, but they eventually merge into, say, a linear type structure. Is that going to produce hail? We wanted to get both the really big hail, but also some small hail, because that doesn't necessarily get reported, especially if it's smaller than 1 inch or 25 millimeters. But as some of the recent Insurance Institute of Business and Home Safety, IBHS, research has found, that can actually be more damaging to roofs and shingles if it's windblown. So yeah, we wanted to try to get just this full coverage of as many different types of hail and storm types as possible. We actually had 2 different checklists, and we kind of checked them off as we went.
Wow, there's so many follow-ups that I want. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask. You kind of alluded to, this kind of storm chasing is very different, and I would agree with that. One of the things I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about is some of the new technology that you guys have employed, because again, field projects like the original Vortex and then Vortex 2 in the early 2000s were great for chasing storms, but technology has changed a lot in the last 15 or 20 years. And I would imagine there's a lot of really cool new tools that you guys have available to do much more sophisticated data collection than we've ever seen in the past. So I'd be interested in hearing about what some of those new tools and techniques are.
So I'll focus from the ground side, because I would say that's something where we spent a lot of time, both of us spent a lot of time taking observations. The deployable disdrometers, right? So being able to do a network of deployable impact disdrometers, right? So there's classical optical disdrometers, which basically take photos of droplets as they fall, right? And they're an optical type sensor. Those tend not to hold up particularly well if you put them in large hails. So we did have some on the project, but we tried to miss the hail with them, sort of focus on smaller hail to rain droplet size, because we were trying to characterize the whole microphysical spectrum, not just the hail alone. But these impact disdrometers are basically devices designed to take impacts. They were deployed with GoPro cameras associated with them, so we could actually get some photogrammetry type information associated with that, and sort of had an idea of what was going on at the time. Those devices actually do saturate. We found the saturation point as part of our deployments. Around about a 10 centimeter 4-inch hailstone is about the kinetic energy equivalent that it sort of takes to saturate one of those. We bent a few aluminum legs as well, just to make things a little bit fun. But we deployed a large array of those, right? So it's not just, we've got one disdrometer here. We were deploying arrays of up to a full 24 of these across the swath of the storm. And that was sort of the center point of our array We also then had devices, which I'll let Becky talk to.
Okay. Well, we also don't want to miss the fact that we have hail pads coming out the wazoo.
And I think Becky's got some of the larger hail pads there. So we actually took
right here.
We took about about 500 or so hail pads out. Now this is sort of a back to the future type technology, right? Hail pads have been used for a long period of time in hail science, back into the 50s, to sort of deploy and capture a record of whether hail occurred or not, and you could infer size information, kinetic energy, and similar if you have some known properties. We actually built a deployable hail pad system and a couple of different ways of doing that to deploy large arrays of these. So we deployed maybe 40 or more instruments in a single array, so that we could cover beyond what the disdrometers can, right? Because the big question with hail is, well, what is the absolute edge of my coverage? A cheap instrument that allows you to do that is really useful. The other thing that's really nice is that if you pair it with a disdrometer, you've now got something which allows you to say, the old relationship said this, here's what I've got that would be comparable to that. How does that compare to if I use the new technology? So actually being able to argue why the new technology adds an advantage to what we are able to do. So at full deployment, and I think we pulled this off once or twice, we put more than 100 devices into the field to measure hail or attendant hazards. We also had mesonet pods, which the same ones they used to put in front of tornadoes. A lot of the work that's been done for that are these hardened pods that have got sonic anemometers, wind anemometers, and then temperature gauges and similar sorts of things. They were co-located with the disdrometers because we also wanted to know a little bit about what does the wind flow look like when a hailstone. Is that driving hail? Is it leading to angle deflections? All sorts of questions like that. We did have some instances where our instruments that were fantastic for deployment got blown over.
That brings up some of my instrumentation. I think I had kind of some of the more newer, untested instruments. One was which developed actually in Canada by the Northern Hail Project, and kind of a upgraded version of what they had been using. In a very simple terms, it's a funnel over a mobile freezer where you're trying to actually put it out at the storm and capture the hail as it falls. It's co-located again with a hail pad. But what is most interesting is it's co-located with a radar that can attempt to measure terminal velocity or fall speed of these hailstones as they come down. So then you have not only the hailstones that have fallen through, you have the distribution of the speeds at which they were falling, which that seems very simple, but it turns out determining the speed at which a hailstone falls is very difficult and something we still don't know, despite having spent a lot of time in the laboratory trying to estimate in a wind tunnel, estimating how fast they're falling. So this gives us the very first real-time look at, hey, what speeds are these things falling at? The second thing was a kind of a hail camera. So it's in essence a fancy camera that looks at a strobe light, and they're synced up to take things together. So as the hailstone falls through, you get a really nice image of it a couple times as it heads towards the ground. That was developed by the University of North Dakota. And the real slick thing about that is that you can see the orientation at which it's falling. Again, something that seems really simple, but that we don't know. You can see the shape of it before it's hit the ground and maybe started melting. Again, you've seen a lot of, if you've seen a lot of hail, you know that those shapes are not, like a perfectly sphere ball. Sometimes they can be, but often they're not. So we can see all sorts of the weird different shapes, the direction at which it's falling. Is it tumbling as it falls? That's actually a real hot topic in the hail community right now, that we're some controversy over whether it tumbles or not. So we might finally get our answers as we start analyzing that. Yes, the tricky part though is that the mobile freezer and wind funnel, it turns out if you have a large wind funnel with a hail pad attached to it, it kind of acts like a sail. And it was Canada maybe doesn't have quite the strong winds that we had, so we kept increasing the number of ways we bolted the dang thing to the ground, and it still managed to tip over on occasion. But we still got a decent amount of data out of it before it could tip over. So yeah, we're working on analyzing that now.
And
something you don't think about.
Yeah.
And I think to the point on the freezer, right? Why would you pure hail, right? Hail that hasn't been adulterated by rainfall, melt, or similar. So going into a freezer like that, the whole purpose of having this device is to try and get an unadulterated hail sample, right, at a local location. And we got some good samples out of doing so, which I think is really novel and I think going to be very interesting to compare to some of our ground selected samples in the same vicinity. Deploying the instruments was sort of the first stage of that equation. The next stage was the collection. And so to cross-validate our observations, to have this sort of high-resolution data set, we went in after the fact and we're collecting huge numbers of hailstones, right? So we were taking thousands of hailstone measurements. In fact, I think I saw the final total somewhere in the vicinity of about 7,000 hailstones were measured, 3-axial dimension, mass. Some of them were 3D, a fair number were 3D scanned, a fair number were also looked at for crush test compression to basically look at how they distribute load and similar. Several thousand were added there, which basically doubled the number of observations we have of that property. So we were using portable freezers, which really weren't an option in prior field campaigns to the extent they are now. We had numerous portable freezers, and then we had some very kind individuals from NCAR, Aaron Bamsa, actually transporting those hailstones back to the cold lab. So a large number of the hailstones we actually collected out in the field are back in the lab now, being analyzed and looked at in a cold lab to sort of look at various different properties from isotopic to cross-sectional to otherwise.
26 boxes worth, actually.
I was just thinking that must be a really big freezer, really big cold lab.
I mean, surprisingly, it's not super big. You can fit maybe about 3 people standing in addition to the hail boxes and the table for equipment, but it's big enough to hold our hailstones and to do, cut them in half, do the additional processing.
So an absolutely insane research project and a great interview as well. If you missed them saying about 7,000 hailstones were collected this spring. One more time here. 7,000 hailstones were collected this spring. That is so impressive. And after hearing Becky and John talk about all the technology that was used in this research, it really shows how extensive this research was. Now, I can't wait for the second part of this interview to come out because Becky talks about how quarter-size hail could actually be more damaging to some places if it's wind-driven. So she talks about the importance of strong wind with these hailstorms. And they're also theorizing that we may be underestimating the strength of an updraft of a thunderstorm, which I think is a fascinating conversation.
So if you guys want to catch the second part of this conversation, make sure to subscribe and look out for that episode in 2 weeks.